September 15, 1944. The Western Pacific Ocean. 2 miles off the coast of Peleliu Island. Major General William Rupertus stood on the bridge of his command ship and told the reporters who had come to cover the operation that it would be over in 4 days. Rough but fast, he had told his staff. 4 days, maybe 5. A week at the outside. The Marines of the 1st Marine Division who were climbing down the cargo nets into their landing craft that morning had heard variations of this estimate and had mixed feelings about it. Fast operations meant less time under fire, which was good. Fast operations against Japanese defensive positions that had been prepared for months on a small island with no room to maneuver were sometimes fast because they were overwhelming and sometimes fast because they were catastrophic. The 1st Marine Division, which had fought at Guadalcanal and had learned things about Japanese defensive fighting that no training manual had yet incorporated, was professionally skeptical of optimistic estimates. Their skepticism was correct. Their estimate of what was coming was not nearly pessimistic enough. What awaited the 1st Marine Division on the island of Peleliu was something that American forces had not encountered before in the Pacific War, a defensive system so thoroughly integrated with the island's terrain that every tactic the Marines had developed at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and every other bloody Pacific island was insufficient against it. A defensive system designed not to stop the Americans at the beach, which Japanese commanders had learned was impossible against American naval gunfire and air support, but to kill Americans at a rate high enough and for long enough to make the cost of victory unacceptable. Lieutenant General Sardai Inoue, commanding Japanese forces in the Palau Islands of which Peleliu was a part, had studied the American assault at Tarawa in November 1943 with the attention of a professional soldier reviewing a lesson that his country could not afford to fail to learn. At Tarawa, the Japanese had defended the beaches with everything they had, and the Americans had taken the island in 76 hours at a cost that shocked the American public when the casualty figures were released. Inoue had taken from Tarawa a conclusion that reversed Japanese defensive doctrine entirely. The beach defense was wrong. The Marines would get ashore regardless of what was placed on the beach because American naval gunfire and air support could suppress any defensive position long enough for assault troops to cross the beach and establish themselves. The correct response was not to stop them at the water's edge but to make the island itself the weapon. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, who commanded the Peleliu garrison of approximately 11,000 men, implemented Inoue's revised doctrine with the thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what was being asked of him and exactly what it meant for him personally. He and his men were going to die on Peleliu. That had been determined before the battle began. The question was not whether they would die, but how many Americans they would take with them and for how long they could sustain the killing. Nakagawa spent the months before the American landing transforming Peleliu's terrain into his weapon. The island's central spine, a series of ridges and hills composed of coral limestone that the Marines would come to call the Umurbrogol, was the key to everything. The limestone was honeycombed with natural caves and ravines that Nakagawa's engineers expanded and connected into a defensive network of extraordinary complexity. 500 interconnected caves and defensive positions, some of them large enough to hold hundreds of men and their equipment, linked by tunnels that allowed defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to American fire. Each cave position was designed with interlocking fields of fire that covered the approaches from multiple angles simultaneously. Positions that could be approached from the front could not be approached from the front because the approach was covered by fire from positions to the left and right. Positions that could be flanked from the left were covered from the right. Positions that seemed vulnerable from above had overhead protection that prevented grenades and explosive charges from reaching the defenders. The entire system was designed around the principle that no single approach to any position was safe, and that clearing the positions required attacking each one from multiple directions simultaneously while under fire from every other position in the network. There was no precedent for this in American military experience. The Marines who landed on Peleliu had been trained in the tactics that had worked at Guadalcanal and Tarawa and every other island. Those tactics, based on the assumption that Japanese defenders would eventually exhaust their ammunition and their will and could be overwhelmed by the combination of American firepower and Marine infantry, did not work in the Umurbrogol. The Marines came ashore on September 15, 1944, and the first hours were as bad as anything the Pacific War had produced. The preliminary naval bombardment that American commanders had believed would suppress or destroy the beach defenses had done less than expected. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding the Naval Fire Support Force, had reported before the landing that there were no more targets to shoot at, that the bombardment had been so thorough that Peleliu had been neutralized. He was wrong. The caves and tunnels that Nakagawa had built were largely impervious to the naval gunfire, and the defenders who had withdrawn into them during the bombardment emerged when the firing stopped. The Marines who crossed the beach faced concentrated fire from positions that the bombardment had not destroyed, from angles that the approach routes had not accounted for, and they took casualties that the pre-battle estimates had not predicted. The 1st Marines, commanded by Colonel Chestipulla, the most decorated Marine in the Corps history, pushed inland from their landing zone on the left flank and immediately encountered the killing ground that Nakagawa had prepared. Louis Burwell Puller had been fighting Marines' wars since Nicaragua in the 1920s. He had 5 Navy crosses. He had fought at Guadalcanal with a ferocity that had become legendary in the Corps. He was 56 years old and had been fighting the Japanese for 3 years with a personal hatred of military incompetence that was as intense as his personal courage. Puller pushed his regiment into the Umurbrogol because that was where the Japanese were and because Marines take objectives, and the Umurbrogol was the objective. He pushed them into terrain that the pre-battle intelligence had not adequately described, against defensive positions that the pre-battle planning had not adequately accounted for, and his regiment began dying in ways that the 4-day estimate could not explain. The 1st Marines suffered casualties that by any rational measure should have caused a halt and a reassessment. In the first days of the operation, Puller's regiment was losing men at rates that consumed entire companies. Rifle companies that had landed with 235 men were reporting effective strengths of 50 or 60 men after days of fighting. The casualties were not coming from single dramatic engagements, but from the accumulated effect of continuous fire from positions that could not be suppressed because suppressing one position simply shifted the fire to another. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who fought at Peleliu with the 5th Marines and whose memoir of the battle became one of the most important first-hand accounts of Pacific War combat ever written, described the Umurbrogol with the specific horror of a man who had been there and could not fully explain it to someone who had not. It was the most ghastly corner of hell I had ever witnessed, Sledge wrote. As far as I could see, there was nothing but the ugly, stinking, blistered coral, heat shimmering up from the rock, and the stench. The unimaginable stench. Dead Marines lay where they had fallen. Nobody could get to them. And the Japanese kept shooting. The heat was its own enemy. Peleliu sits just 7 degrees north of the equator, and September is among the hottest months. Temperatures on the exposed coral ridges reached 115 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. Water resupply failed repeatedly because the terrain made movement to forward positions under fire nearly impossible, and because the island's coral absorbed heat and radiated it back at a level that caused heat casualties at rates that the medical planning had not anticipated. Marines who had been fighting in the heat for days developed a physical and psychological deterioration that combined with combat casualties to reduce unit effectiveness in ways that simple casualty counts did not capture. The fighting that consumed the 1st Marine Division in the Umurbrogol over the following weeks was some of the most intimate and costly combat in the Pacific War. Not the dramatic charges and countercharges of Guadalcanal or the concentrated horror of the first hours at Tarawa, but a grinding, day by day, cave by cave, ridge by ridge destruction of a defensive system that had been designed specifically to survive everything that the Americans could bring against it. The weapon that eventually gave American forces the ability to attack cave positions that could not be approached from the front was the flamethrower, the same weapon that had been decisive at Iwo Jima and that here again fell to the men who were willing to carry the tanks of burning fuel up coral ridges under fire from every direction. The men who carried flamethrowers at Peleliu were doing something that every man around them understood was extraordinarily dangerous and that the tactical situation required regardless of the danger. They were the men who could silence a cave position that rifles and grenades and artillery could not silence, and so they carried the tanks up the ridges and they did what the situation required, and many of them did not come down. Sergeant Elmo Haney, a Marine veteran whose military career had begun in the First World War, was in his 40s at Peleliu, old enough to be the father of most of the men around him, still fighting because the Corps was what he was and the war was what the Corps required of him. His presence in the front lines was a source of both inspiration and concern to his officers, who were not certain whether his participation was an asset or a liability, and who eventually concluded that any man who wanted to be at the front of an assault in the Umurbrogol had qualities that the situation required regardless of other considerations. The Army's 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, relieved the shattered 1st Marines after 10 days of fighting and took over the battle for the Umurbrogol. The Marines of the 5th and 7th Marine Regiments continued fighting in other sectors of the island. The Army infantry who entered the Umurbrogol found the same terrain and the same defensive system and the same grinding, lethal, daily attrition that had consumed the Marines. They fought through it with the same stubborn determination that the situation demanded. Colonel Nakagawa conducted his defense with the professional skill that the pre-battle planning should have anticipated but did not. He rotated his defenders through the cave positions, preventing the fatigue and attrition that would have been their primary enemies in a conventional defensive battle. He used the tunnel system to reinforce threatened positions before they were overrun, withdrawing defenders through the tunnels when American pressure became too great and establishing new positions deeper in the system. He made the Americans pay for every foot of the Umurbrogol in casualties that accumulated day by day into numbers that shocked the commanders who had estimated 4 days. The battle for the Umurbrogol lasted 73 days. The final pocket of Japanese resistance was declared eliminated on November 27, 1944, more than 2 months after the 4-day estimate had predicted the operation would be complete. The casualty figures told the story of what those 73 days had cost. The 1st Marine Division suffered 6,526 casualties, including 1,252 killed. The 81st Infantry Division suffered 3,278 casualties, including 542 killed. Total American casualties exceeded 9,800, a number that represented approximately 40% of the force committed to the operation. Of Nakagawa's 11,000 defenders, only 202 were captured. The remainder died in the caves and the tunnels and the ridge positions they had built and defended with the knowledge that they were going to die there from the day the American landing craft appeared on the horizon. Nakagawa himself died on November 24, 3 days before the island was declared secure. He had fulfilled his mission, not by stopping the Americans, which had never been the point, but by making them pay a price that no pre-battle estimate had predicted and that no subsequent analysis has fully explained in terms that satisfy the families of the men who paid it. The strategic value of Peleliu has been debated ever since the battle ended. The island had been seized to protect MacArthur's right flank during the return to the Philippines. But military historians have argued, and the argument has substantial merit, that the threat to MacArthur's flank was not as severe as the pre-battle assessment suggested and that Peleliu could have been bypassed, leaving its garrison to wither without supply as American forces swept past it toward more important objectives. Nimitz later acknowledged that the seizure of Peleliu may have been unnecessary. MacArthur did not disagree. The men who fought there and the families of the men who died there have their own views on the question of whether Peleliu was necessary, views that are not always compatible with the strategic analyses conducted by people who were not there. What is not debated is what the men of the 1st Marine Division and the 81st Infantry Division accomplished in 73 days of fighting on 8 square miles of coral and limestone against a defensive system that had been specifically designed to defeat everything they could bring against it. They took the island. They cleared the caves one at a time and the ridges one at a time and the tunnels one at a time, under fire that did not stop and in heat that did not relent and with casualties that accumulated past every estimate into numbers that the Corps and the division would carry for decades. Eugene Sledge, who survived Peleliu and later fought at Okinawa, which was itself one of the costliest battles of the Pacific War, wrote in his memoir that Peleliu was the worst thing he had experienced and that Okinawa, for all its horror, had not surpassed it. He wrote that the men who fought in the Umurbrogol deserved to be remembered, not celebrated in the way that Iwo Jima has been celebrated, with its famous photograph and its monument and its place in the cultural memory of the nation. Simply remembered. Known. Acknowledged. They took an island that did not need to be taken. They took it anyway because they were ordered to take it and because Marines take their objectives and because the men around them needed them to keep going and because stopping was not what Marines do in the Umurbrogol or anywhere else. Private First Class Arthur Jackson, 19 years old, assaulted 12 separate Japanese fortified positions on September 18, 1944, killing more than 50 Japanese soldiers in a single day's fighting to protect the men of his company. He received the Medal of Honor, one of 8 awarded to Marines at Peleliu. Staff Sergeant Darrell Cole, a machine gunner who had been told as a recruit that his eyesight was too poor for a combat role, attacked 3 Japanese machine gun positions single-handedly because his company's advance had been stopped and someone had to silence them. He used grenades, his pistol, and finally captured Japanese grenades when his own ran out. He silenced all 3 positions. He was killed by a 4th grenade before he could be evacuated. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. These men, and the thousands like them whose specific acts of valor were not witnessed in the chaos and carnage of the Umurbrogol, fought in a battle that most Americans have never heard of, for an island that military analysts later concluded might not have needed to be taken, against a defensive system that was specifically designed to kill them in numbers sufficient to break American will. They did not break. No Marine broke in the Umurbrogol. They fought until they were casualties or until the island was secure, and when it was secure they carried their dead down from the ridges and boarded their ships and went on to the next island. The Umurbrogol still stands on Peleliu, the coral ridges overgrown now with 70 years of jungle vegetation. The caves are still there, sealed or partially collapsed, the bones of the men who died in them still inside in many cases because they could not be recovered. The heat is the same heat that cooked the Marines in September and October and November of 1944. The coral is the same coral. What is gone is the men who fought there, most of them now, carried away by the years that pass for everyone who survives the things that should not be survived. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be known. They took an island in 73 days that was supposed to fall in 4 against a defender who had designed every feature of the terrain to kill them, and they did it the only way it could be done, one cave at a time, one ridge at a time, one day at a time, until there was nothing left to take. That is Peleliu. That is what it cost and what it meant and what the men who fought there were.